Hi, thanks for clicking on this video. It's going to feature spoilers, so if you haven't yet seen The Umbrella Academy on Netflix, then please do, you won't regret it. I really hope you enjoy this video essay because I have really enjoyed putting it together. So in summary, The Umbrella Academy nails the fallout of childhood trauma and dysfunctional family dynamics. If you are struggling with adulthood, following shit that happened when you were a kid or a teen, this show will make you feel seen and also call you out. The story is set within an X-Men style superhero academy, and most of the characters have powers, but its real strength, in my opinion, is using the superhero genre to offer a great study of how childhood abuse can destroy families and impact the victims well into adulthood. Be aware that it features scenes of drug use, self-harm, discusses childhood trauma, and contains violence. I regard the show as essentially uplifting and empowering, and it's well balanced with music and humour, but it can be a tough watch at times. This video essay isn't going to be listing the hundreds of reasons why I think this show is one of the best I've seen in years, and possibly the best at addressing these issues of broken family dynamics following trauma. Instead, I'm going to focus on each of the main characters and talk about how they represent real-life responses to abuse, as well as common unhealthy mentalities that can follow a difficult childhood. One more note here, I've not read the comics and will not be referencing them here. This is purely based on the Netflix series adapted by Steve Blackman and Jeremy Slater for Netflix. The TV show is of course an adaptation of the comics created by Gerard Way and Gabriel Barr. So let's jump into dysfunctional families, the fallout of abuse, and reactions to trauma. At the start of the series, the Umbrella Academy have drifted apart and have only been drawn back together with the death of their adoptive father. Their relationships are fractured, and the first episode is aptly named "We Only See Each Other at Weddings and Funerals." As we later learn, this distance is not because they hate each other or because of the friction between certain members of the team. In my opinion, this dispersal of the family represents how being together again in the childhood home reminds them of the trauma they are desperate to escape. All but one of the team are attempting to move on, and have dealt with their pain by breaking away from the family group. As admirable as this drive for independence is, it's clear that moving away from their family has left them all lonely and vulnerable. As the series progresses, the characters learn that they can connect as a family group and accept their shared trauma without that meaning their father holds power over them. They attempt to reclaim the family home, a move that fails because of the exclusion of one sibling, something I will get to later. But it's clear that for each of the siblings, perhaps with the exception of Luther, the Umbrella Academy represents pain, alienation, and lost childhood. That's not to say Luther has not suffered under that roof and at the hands of their father. In fact, he has suffered more than most, but he is a character who is still in the early stages of acceptance, and as we see during the series, he fights the notion that his father mistreated him for as long as he can. So in spite of the amusing interactions, most notably Klaus and Allison in Hargreaves' study, what the first episode offers is differing reactions to the death of the primary abuser. Luther shows respect and deference to their father, as he did when he was alive. He still idolises him to some degree. He assembles the group to scatter his father's ashes, which fall pathetically to the ground, much to Luther's embarrassment. It's one of the many metaphors in the show for Luther's grand heroic idea for his father not aligning with the real man. Diego is cynical, but shows up because he seems to think he should, perhaps for the sake of protecting his mother, who he fears will be implicated in their father's death. He's been investigating their father's death solo, which implies that despite him pretending not to care, he's more emotionally connected to his father and their home than he would like people to think. He tells Luther that their father was a sad old man who kicked it in a big empty house just like he deserved. But as we learn with Diego, his emotions are repressed, and he attempts to channel them through his vigilante work and in the boxing ring. When the group are gathered by Luther to discuss where to scatter their father's ashes, Diego sits away from his siblings, trying to distance himself from the family, but unable to actually leave them. Allison seems the most calm and collected. She greets Vanya when she arrives and appears relatively unflustered. Allison represents a lack of reaction or emotion. Instead of having some epiphany or sense of freedom, Allison feels exactly as she did before. Their father is dead, but their pasts have not changed. She does react warmly towards her siblings and Luther. I struggle to define Luther and Allison as siblings for reasons I will explain later, but the main vibe I personally got from Allison during the scattering of ashes was impatience. She laughs when Klaus jokes about the death of their father, but seems detached. Mostly she is a peacekeeper when the family reunite, protecting Vanya from Diego's anger, ironically playing an almost mother figure. This is ironic as she has lost custody of her own child. Klaus, fresh out of rehab, appears delighted by their father's death, and seems to find the whole situation amusing. He makes constant jokes about their father's cold, dead eyes, mimics him, and suggests he's playing tennis with Hitler. Klaus is clearly well aware of the abuse of his father and the trauma of his childhood, but he isn't resistant to connecting with the others. A personality trait of Klaus is that he's charming, and so all except for Luther cannot help but like him. However, this dramatic excitement at their father's death could be an act. Klaus is an impulsive character who appears to change his feelings about his childhood often. He never attempts to excuse it the way that Luther does, but out of all of the siblings, Klaus is the one who can go from calling their joint childhood hell to remembering funny stories about what they all got up to. Him stealing from his father to pay for drugs is also symbolic. He believes his father owes him something and calls the stealing in advance on his inheritance. There's a sense of rebellion to Klaus, parading about their stern father's home with Allison's skirt on, clutching alcohol and a cigarette. Klaus appears to be pushing for a reaction, which of course he can no longer get. Finally, Vanya deals with their father's death like she does everything else, quietly, unobtrusively, and with acceptance. She asks Pogo if their father ever read the book she wrote, still hoping that he might have displayed some act of care for her after she left, but she is disappointed to hear that he didn't. Vanya enters the home as an outsider, like a guest. She is the one sibling who is tentative, who doesn't own the space. Allison embracing her is a relief for Vanya, but none of the other siblings need this approval from the others. She is mostly quiet, talks only when necessary, and seems almost drowned out by the reactions and strong personalities of the others. Perhaps like Allison she feels numb, but with Vanya there's also a sense of disappointment, that she was never special to her father, not even once. Now I've spoken about their reactions to the death of their abusive father figure, I wanted to get on to talking about how each member of the group have developed. I want to discuss their personalities and how they each represent different ways in which childhood abuse can cause havoc for an adult. I'm going to discuss the team in number order, so let's start with Luther, number 1. Luther is the last to come to terms with the fact their father was abusive. He's been conditioned to be loyal, to believe his father only did what he did for their own good. Once the others had left, Luther was the only one who stayed in the family home and continued to follow orders. He felt a duty towards his father, like showing loyalty might finally win him some love or affection. Luther clearly believed, and perhaps still does believe, that love has to be earned, which is why he is frightened of breaking rules or any kind of rebellion. This is why he reacts so strongly to Diego making his own path, and to Klaus flouting any kind of social norms and being whoever he chooses. Even after their father's death, Luther is fearful of letting him down. I believe Luther's broad shoulders are a metaphor for him having the weight of the world on them. He's like Atlas, believing he has to hold the sky up or else it will fall. Luther hasn't had a proper life. The others escape the toxic environment in different ways, but Luther knows nothing else. He hasn't had friendships or relationships. He's been isolated, quite literally. Luther is the personification of loneliness. Luther is what happens when a small child is given too much responsibility. He denies himself happiness because he was praised for following orders and sacrificing. In the time after the others have left the academy, Luther is sent on a mission on his own. He gets badly hurt and almost dies, so Sir Reginald injects him with a serum that gives him the upper body of an ape. When Luther wakes up, he is horrified. This element of body horror just brings home the trust Luther has in his father, but the pain his father inflicts. While the viewer sees this as a metaphor for how Reginald is destroying Luther's development as his own person, Luther's conflict remains the same. He hates what he has been made, he's ashamed, but he still tells himself that his father meant well. He was number 1, which meant something, didn't it? Following the serum, Reginald sends Luther on a mission to the moon, where he remains for 4 years. 4 years of isolation. Luther dutifully sends home samples, accepting the hardships to help his father. He thinks nothing of abandoning the world, his relationships, to please Sir Reginald. He believes that at the end of it all, his father will recognise his hard work and love him. Unfortunately, that love and acknowledgement never happens. Once Reginald is dead, Luther finds all the samples he sent home from the moon are unopened. His father never even looked at them. This is the moment one realises he's wasted his life trying to please a man who never even saw him as a person. It's the start of another struggle for Luther, which I imagine will be explored for him in the next season. How can he be a leader, but without emulating his father? How can he push aside the thought processes his father conditioned him with? By the end of the season, Luther still hasn't stopped making excuses for his father, but he does seem to understand that he was harmed by him, just the same as the others. Having a character still be in the midst of that struggle, one we presume all the characters went through years ago, is effective, as it demonstrates quite how hard it is for a person to accept they were abused by someone they love, and that everything they once knew was a lie. Luther's whole life and identity has been tied to being a leader, to his identity as number 1. But when his father dies, his number, his rank, counts for nothing. Luther's powers are strength and endurance. To me, these powers offer a brilliant contradiction. Yes, Luther can endure the most, but forcing this facade of strength has arguably made him the weakest of the group. He has the least personal identity, and cannot seem to think of himself as an individual. Luther has endured when he never should have had to. As a viewer, I felt furious with Luther when he locked Vanya up, despite the protests of the rest of the group. But in terms of his character, it makes perfect sense. Luther believes he is the one to make the hard choices. He believes in sacrifice. And I think had Luther been the one to put the group in danger, he would willingly have walked into that cell and locked the door himself. Luther does not see Vanya as his sister in that moment, just as throughout his life he's not thought of himself as a person. In my opinion, Luther exemplifies some elements of toxic masculinity. Let me just define that term, as some people aren't fond of it. I'm using it here to represent the pressures and gender roles forced on men and boys. It's important to note that in Luther's darker moments, it's when he's trying to live up to his father's expectations, not acting in a way that represents himself. Luther is actually kind and sensitive. We see that he's shy and loving in personal moments. But in order to be the leader, to be the one that asserts authority on behalf of his father, he doesn't listen to the others. He tries to make decisions for the group which ultimately end up harming them. In the scene where Vanya is locked away, Luther works as a proxy for his father. He is repeating his mistakes and demonstrates how fathers can pass on this toxicity to their sons who are just as harmed by this expectation as their victims. Something I want to touch on here is Luther's relationship with Allison. Luther has loved Allison since they were teens, but he's never pursued it. The mission and the work have always come first, and so Allison left him and married someone else. Luther, however, never moved on. I have to be honest, Luther and Allison made me feel a bit uncomfortable at first, as I read the team as siblings. However, as we went forward, I began to understand. These are kids who didn't grow up as a family, they weren't brought up as siblings. Part of their problem is that they were never a family, they were a team, a school, an academy, hence the name. They never even had the luxury of identity beyond their numbers. It is only later on that they themselves tried to figure out what they all meant to each other, which is something ongoing in the series. It's very much about found family, trying to salvage the good from the bad, working out how they can be there for each other in a way that is cohesive, but nothing like the life they lived with their father. In the show, various characters refer to themselves as brothers and sisters, but never Luther and Allison. I mean, that's an interesting study in itself. I'm not talking Game of Thrones here, but if we're talking actual incest, look at Jaime and Cersei Lannister, who only had each other and trusted nobody else. Is there an element of that dynamic, but without the actual incest, here? Maybe there is. These kids all have issues with trust and outside relationships. Is this attachment between Luther and Allison symbolic of Luther latching on to someone he believed would always be there for him? I think it demonstrates his inability to exist outside of the family system. Now I'm going to move on to Diego, number 2. Diego is cynical and bitter. He dresses in all black and a lot of leather, a Batman-style vigilante, fighting injustice from the shadows. Diego couldn't cope with simply being number 2, and so escaped to live his own life. Diego is determined not to be a victim, perhaps even more so than Luther. This hard persona is often betrayed by his actions, and viewers see a side to Diego he is desperate to mask. Diego is sensitive, and despite being dismissive to Vanya early on, he's actually pretty sensitive when it comes to his siblings, and has moments where he goes out of his way to look out for them. This side of Diego comes out most prominently when he's with Klaus, who he seems to read as more vulnerable than the others, and therefore protects. This same instinct to protect who he regards as the underdog is demonstrated in Diego's closeness to his mother. He can go from sparring with Luther to being soft and compassionate to Grace. Diego's first scene is him saving a family from armed robbers, which paints him as a defender of the helpless right off the bat. With regard to Diego's initially dismissive treatment of Vanya, I believe this is more because Diego fears being viewed as a victim, and Vanya published a book which revealed the truth of their upbringing. Diego is determined not to be passive. He's never being under the control of anyone again, which is why he operates outside of the law. In contrast to Luther, Diego lashes out at any and all authority figures. This is why his relationship with Detective Patch is so tragic. He can't let go of his mistrust of power and authority, and this inability to do things by the book drives them apart. My personal opinion is that Diego is the most emotionally attuned and emotionally intelligent of the group. As a child, we see him struggle with a stammer, which his mother Grace supports him through. So much of Diego's anger, again in my opinion, is not about his own mistreatment, but the mistreatment of his siblings, and especially their mother. He is the only one who seems to consider her perspective, and is able to put himself in her shoes. He appreciates her sacrifices, and hates his father for never giving her a bed to sleep in. Diego is convinced that despite being created by their father, Grace evolved to love them over time. But is this true? The show offers no answers. Diego seems desperate to believe his mother was separate from his father, not his creation at all, but in the end she defends him, as she was built. One of Diego's biggest emotional moments is having to shut her down as she is malfunctioning, and he can't bear for the others to vote on it and take action, for Luther to make that decision. For me, seeing Diego stammer again when Grace is destroyed along with the Academy is one of the most upsetting moments of the series. Diego's tragedy is that he was a powerless child who is now desperate to prove he is under nobody's control. In arguments with Luther, Diego is often portrayed as being smarter and presenting good points, but he loses his temper too fast. When Patch is killed by Cha-Cha, Diego vows revenge, but ultimately he can't kill someone on Patch's behalf. This encapsulates his whole personality. Diego presents himself as no-nonsense, willing to do what has to be done, but he's sensitive, emotionally intelligent, empathetic, and ultimately a good person. He lets Cha-Cha go because he knows it is what Patch would have wanted. This ability to empathise is what differentiates his approach from Luther, who tunes out emotions when it comes to missions. I just want to touch on Diego and Luther's relationship here. In differing ways, they feel a huge sense of justice and responsibility. Their goals are similar, but Diego wants to assert himself as an individual who won't be controlled, and Luther wants to follow orders and is happy to be number one. Their conflict isn't really about their ideas, as in many ways they align, but Diego resents Luther being number one, along with pitying him for still believing their dad's lies. This could be because Diego sees his old self in Luther before he broke away. It does seem that hearing Luther parrot their father, the perfect soldier, hurts Diego both for his brother's sake and on a personal level. Diego struggles with viewing himself as a victim, although he accepts their father was in the wrong. Seeing Luther personify the brainwashing of Hargreaves could be too much for him. From Luther's perspective, he regards Diego asserting autonomy as selfish. He misunderstands Diego's cynicism with him being a troublemaker and mocks Diego's attempts to take on the world on his own, even though really that's what Luther's been doing too. I think these two could be a powerful pair in the future if they learn to put aside their differences and try to understand one another. For all the sniping, there's clearly love there. Time for number 3, Allison. Now to me, Allison is a fascinating character because she was the golden child. Allison's power is being able to use the words, "I heard a rumour," to make anything she likes happen. She uses the power sparingly because of the consequences, but as a child it is implied she used it to get the best treatment from their father. She didn't get love, but she certainly got away with more than the others. If you're not familiar with the concept of the golden child and scapegoat in abusive family dynamics, then you might want to look that up, because it can certainly be related to Allison and Vanya here. Allison was a child in a toxic environment struggling to cope, and her father made her complicit in the abuse of her sister Vanya. Allison's story is of someone who feels nothing in her life was real. What was her powers and what was genuine? Do people actually like her, or is it her power? This is why she loves Luther, because he understands her power and accepts her as she is. Allison personifies imposter syndrome. She's made herself a celebrity. She's an actress in the public eye, but people don't really know her. She's an image. When she's praised for her acting talents, we don't know if she's genuinely gifted, or if again, it's her power. I'm especially interested in Allison's relationship with Vanya, because she undoubtedly loves her sister, but she doesn't understand her experience. In this instance, Allison comes at the issue from a place of privilege. It takes her a while to fully understand what Vanya being left out has done to her. At one point, Allison tells Vanya she has nobody to blame for her life and her decisions but herself. I believe Allison is projecting here, and this betrays how Allison views her own life. It certainly says far more about Allison than it does about Vanya, who has every right to hold their father accountable. Allison is a character that seems the most normal of the group. She's an adult with a career, and she appears sorted, but she has major internal conflict. She's full of guilt, which can make her snap, but she also experiences the shifting between blaming herself for everything and blaming their father. In reality, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Allison is not to blame for anything that happened in their childhood, but she's right to want to make amends for the alienation of Vanya during adulthood. Allison is an inspirational character who constantly messes up, but tries to do better. She can be sharp and unkind. She snaps at Vanya, but later goes to find her and apologise. With Allison, you can really see the first instinct being the one created by their father, and the second being the real her, kind, a good sister, and wanting to do what's right. Allison is a child that was made complicit in the abuse of her sister. She is blameless in this, but it complicates Vanya and Allison's relationship immensely. A huge moment for me was when Allison, unable to speak because of Vanya damaging her vocal cords, tried to get Vanya out of the cell and wrote down that it was her own fault. Allison sometimes needs a bit of time to think on things, but she does hold herself accountable every time. Despite them being the same age, Allison feels very much like a big sister to Vanya, who looks out for her. In the series, we know that Allison has lost custody of her daughter because her husband Patrick caught her using her power to make their daughter fall asleep during a tantrum. Allison tortures herself over this and makes no excuses. She loves her daughter more than anyone, but with no example set, she doesn't know how to be a parent. She doesn't have enough faith in her own parenting skills. This is a woman who is trying to break the cycle and do better. Ironically, viewers can see she's got all the skills necessary to be a brilliant mother without her powers. She's a stabilising influence in the group, and the one member of the team who refused to give up on Vanya, even though she arguably had the most reason to. Time for number 4, Klaus, and cards on the table, he's my personal favourite. In some ways, I view Klaus as an eternal child. He's charming but irresponsible. He's an addict who uses drink and drugs to escape his trauma and fears his own mind. In complete opposition to Luther and to some extent Diego, Klaus's reaction to their treatment by Hardgreaves is to be his true self unapologetically. In some ways, he makes his self-expression a performance, asserting his identity through clothing. Klaus's fuck you to his father is in doing what he wants, wearing what he wants, and being who he wants. There's a lot to like about Klaus, and a lot of lessons viewers can learn from him. However, in some ways Klaus can take this too far, because he lives purely in the moment. He's not a character who plans ahead. Instead, he acts impulsively. He never has money to fund his drug habit, and is constantly pawning items in order to get high. He can't drive, and tags along with his siblings when he needs a lift, although he does drive an ice cream van at one point, which is made all the more hilarious from knowing he isn't a driver. Klaus's power is that he sees and can communicate with the dead. When he was a child, his father locked him in a crypt to face his fear for hours at a time. This terrified Klaus, and there are some really horrific scenes of his fear in the show. To put that into a more real-world context, this is a kid with mental health issues or huge anxiety, who instead of being shown compassion to help him with this, is being told to face his fears. Perhaps this is another example of toxic masculinity here, something Klaus rejects with aplomb. Klaus is expected to deal with it, to bottle those emotions, to ignore the fear. His cries for help result in nothing. Nobody comes to save him. But instead of this making Klaus independent, as Hardgreaves seems to intend, it traumatizes Klaus into a state of helplessness. He doesn't trust himself to be able to cope with life, hence the drugs. He lives one day at a time, just trying to feel something. An example of Klaus being trapped in this state of immaturity is when he's asked to attempt to communicate with his father following his death. Klaus tries unsuccessfully to speak to Reginald, but when he believes he has managed it, it's actually 5 arriving, Klaus's look of fear betrays him. He turns childlike, calling him daddy. It's a blink or you'll miss it moment, but Klaus is intimidated. Something I quickly want to talk about here is the queer coding surrounding Klaus, which is something that breaks the mould. Forgive my tangent here, but characters coded like Klaus are usually the villains. Dramatic, flamboyant, playing with gender roles. You see this in the Disney films, for example, and in modern villains like Moriarty in Sherlock or Raoul Silver from Skyfall. I'm going to link a video by an amazing YouTuber called Rowan who discusses the idea of queer coding in great depth. The fact this refusal to conform to gender norms is usually given to villains is to make this feel other and dangerous. But in having Klaus, one of, if not the most likeable character, display these traits as part of a full personality, the Umbrella Academy has done something brilliant. Klaus is LGBT, probably gay, but we don't know for certain. He has a significant relationship with a man, which is a huge part of his plot and development through the series. He doesn't face homophobia from his siblings at all. Maybe a bit of heteronormativity, but that's it. The scene where Diego doesn't flinch at Klaus revealing he's fallen in love with a man, and instead commends Dave for putting up with Klaus's weird shit, is heartwarming. It's refreshing to see Klaus's sexuality not used as an aspect to make him seem more wild and out there. In fact, Klaus's love for Dave is probably the most normal thing about him. His relationship with a man brings him stability, it matures him, it makes him put someone else first. It drives his hero arc. But equally, it doesn't deprive him of his self-expression. Klaus is able to remain flamboyant and deny gender roles, while showing real growth through his love for a man. This is speculation on my part, because I think way too much into it, but I imagine in terms of his relationship with Dave, we have a flipped dynamic. Klaus is used to being the sibling that isn't trusted. They treat him as a lovable burden at times. But here we have him dropping into Vietnam in the 60s, a time when being gay would have been hugely dangerous, and many people would have been closeted for their own safety, especially in the military. He drops into Dave's life, a soldier we expect is having to keep his sexuality secret, and offers him truth. I like that in the flashback scenes to Klaus and Dave, it's actually Dave that appears to be trying to build the courage to confess his feelings to an oblivious Klaus. Klaus has been able to positively influence someone's personal growth, and more importantly, he's learned to put others before himself. Klaus is not an intentionally selfish character, but through loving Dave, he's driven to care for someone more than his own needs, his own drugs. Klaus gets clean with the help of Diego and Ben, so that he can see Dave again. The power of the love between the two men, the purity of it, is enough to start Klaus's journey to getting clean. When Klaus finally sees his father in a version of the afterlife, Klaus pushes for a moment of recognition, for some hint that there's something good in their father and that he loved them. He asks his father about what he did to Luther, and his father admits it was a mistake, but only because he shouldn't have let Luther find the unopened samples. This is Klaus's moment. This is when he finally gives up. In some ways it's for Luther. Klaus isn't even especially close to Luther, but it's seeing how their father can't recognise the pain he's caused him that snaps Klaus. Klaus is now in a position to have known real love, to be in a more stable family unit, or at least a family unit that is trying their best, and he is able to leave this yearning for his father's love behind. I look forward to Klaus's journey next season, as it is implied there is more to be discovered with regard to his powers, especially if he can manage to stay clean. A more selfless, sorted Klaus is going to be interesting to watch. Time for number 5. 5 is the only sibling who has kept his number in the place of a name. This does not seem to be because 5 is particularly attached to the name, more that he doesn't care. There are bigger issues to him, and the name has no power over him either way. As a child, we see that 5 is precocious. He's fiercely intelligent, to the point of arrogance, and because of this he ends up time travelling to the apocalypse with no ability to get back to the team. 5 is by far the most independent of the group. He literally learns survival skills, and can easily exist on his own. In some ways, this demonstrates how in leaving the Umbrella Academy, he was freed. Despite the traumatic experience, 5 was lost just young enough to lose any dependence on anyone but himself. 5 is the team member who will get the job done. Nothing phases him. However, along the way, 5 has also lost a lot of his empathy. We get the impression that despite thinking himself superior to the others, he was close to them when he was a child. When he first time travels, he calls out for Vanya and Ben. When he sees the bodies of his adult siblings, he is horrified. Slowly, as he lives life on his own, barely surviving, trying to figure out how to get back, 5 loses his attachments to everyone except one shop mannequin he names Dolores and keeps as a companion. In order to get home, 5 accepts the offer from the Commission to become an assassin in different time periods. A fully grown man now, he completes these tasks, but all the time he is figuring out the right equation to allow him to return home. He refuses to shoot President Kennedy, although somebody else does, which shows he takes no pleasure in his work. And after a conversation with Luther later on, we realise 5 has become desensitised to death and violence. As he views it, everyone will die in the apocalypse anyway, so the deaths hardly matter. 5 is no longer under the spell of their father. Having lived a whole life and then reverted to his young body, he has the knowledge and life experience to realise his father is irrelevant now. He seems frustrated by the way the rest of the group is still impacted by his actions and can't move on. In some ways, I believe 5 represents an older victim of abuse, having thrown the past off. His life no longer revolves around their mistreatment, but this seems to come with age, and with time. Number 6 is Ben. Ben died as a child during a mission, and it is implied that Ben dying was in part what made the team disperse in the first place. He now only appears to his brother Klaus, who can talk to the dead. In a similar way to 5, Ben's death has actually spared him many of the problems of his siblings. The Ben that talks to Klaus is sensible, intelligent, and reasonable. There is a sense of deep sadness and loss to Ben. He clearly longs to be alive, and tells Klaus how painful it is to see him throwing away his life on drugs, when Ben would do anything to live his life again. In some ways, Ben represents the consequences of abuse. It quite literally kills him. His whole future is destroyed, all his potential lost. Ben is shown as a child to be studious, as he reads at the dinner table. He seems to have a lot of promise, but the abuse he and the team suffered had a casualty. As viewers, we can see the true scale of this loss, and we are able to witness the man Ben is now. He's likeable, a good brother to Klaus, and it's frustrating and upsetting that he is unable to communicate with his siblings. Ben also represents a warning not to allow one man's abuse to control the rest of your life. His sadness at what has become of Klaus is all about lost potential, and that's what Ben is essentially a metaphor for. I really hope that Ben is able to communicate with his siblings more through Klaus in the next series, because I just really want to see that sibling interaction. Lastly, but certainly not least, is Vanya, number 7. She is another of my personal favourites. Vanya is the child that's left out of the group. She has been told she has no powers, when in reality she's the most powerful of all. She was told she was ill, as were the other children, who were encouraged to leave her out. Vanya is the constant outsider. She's always been told she's not special, not talented. She feels out of place wherever she goes, even displaying unease in her own apartment. Her body language is closed off. She uses small movements and wears clothes that won't draw attention to her. She apologises constantly, something that Leonard, or Harold, points out. Vanya has been taught to apologise for existing, for taking up space. Her response to abuse has been to believe she is insignificant. At the start of the series, Vanya has published a book about her traumatic childhood, talking about the strange experiences of the Umbrella Academy. This has made her an outcast among the other siblings. They at first view her as betraying them, as a traitor, because she's laying the truth bare. You can understand their perspectives, as it's their lives too, and some of them would rather people didn't know about the trauma. Especially Diego, for example, who is trying to reinvent himself and hates that because of the book, others might view him as a victim. But it's the one time Vanya is bold enough to assert herself, and in response, she's alienated again. She's trying to create a life for herself, and it's just about managing. Her only passion and joy in life is playing violin, but despite her talent, she lacks the confidence to go for the first chair at her orchestra. She teaches violin to kids from a small apartment, but she's very lonely. Vanya is the Cinderella character of the series. The others get to go to the ball while she is left out. In the scene where the team foil a bank heist, Vanya is shown standing some distance away with her father, looking on. In some ways, the others resent her for being upset and feeling hard done by, because them being sent on missions and trained mess them up in other ways. But they don't understand her pain at being left out. All of them were abused, but differently. It takes them a while to really understand what they have taken part in, what Reginald encouraged, and how worthless that has made Vanya feel. Now, Vanya bottles her emotions. So Reginald gave her pills and told her she was ill, so her powers could never mature. Her sister Allison actually took part in the brainwashing of Vanya to make her forget her powers, which wasn't Allison's fault. Vanya has to take her pills every time she feels an emotion. She does it constantly in times of stress on the show. This message isn't anti-medication, I should add. It's anti-making someone think feeling powerful emotions is something that has to be treated or to be toned down. What actually happens is Vanya ends up having a full breakdown and loses control of her powers, causing the apocalypse. The years of built-up pain bring about the end of the world. Vanya is manipulated in the show because of her trauma. She's been made to feel unlovable and ordinary, so the moment someone tells her she's special, she forms an attachment and trusts him too fast. When Allison tries to look out for her and warn her, Vanya interprets the warning as her sister trying to stop her being happy. She trusts nobody but Leonard, and when he is revealed to be using her, Vanya can't cope. Vanya is the ticking time bomb of the series. The team spend the series trying to stop the apocalypse, when in reality, including Vanya and making her feel loved is all they needed to do. The team do all care about Vanya, but because she feels like an outcast, Vanya can't accept it. To her, she is simply a burden to them, the one without powers, the black sheep of the family. It is Luther's decision to replicate the actions of his father and imprison Vanya that ends the world. Because he connects with her as a weapon instead of as his sister, the apocalypse happens. This message is made loud and clear by Vanya's reaction to seeing Allison turn up at her concert. Although she is consumed by her powers at this point, when she sees her sister has come to see her play, Vanya smiles. It is probably the first genuine smile we see from Vanya all series. It's a heartbreaking moment, especially when we know she is about to be ambushed without Allison's knowledge. Vanya is one of the bravest characters in the show. After hurting and potentially killing Allison, she turns up at the academy to see if she's okay. Despite the shame, knowing she might be hurt, knowing she will be hated, she is brave enough to want to see her sister. Her love for Allison makes a usually timid character brave. It's a small but heroic moment that is painfully ended by Luther squeezing her unconscious in what she believes to be a hug. This act is a metaphor for Vanya. She cannot trust in the love of her siblings. The one time she believes she has acceptance, it's a trick. This is what drives her over the edge. I'll wrap this up now. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the Umbrella Academy. This show has changed my life for the better, and I can honestly say it's one of the best shows I have ever had the pleasure of watching. I have a PayPal too, so if you fancy donating, there's a link in the description box. Thanks so much for listening, and I would love to hear your own thoughts about this lovable but incredibly dysfunctional family in the comments. Love you loads. Bye!